Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wojciech Szczerba. I'm a rector, president of Evangelical School of Theology in Wroclaw, Poland. And in our ecumenical school, we believe in doing theology in a contextual way, in a dialogue which goes beyond doctrinal boundaries and divisions. And we believe in theology which honors another person and tries really to learn from his and from her questions, experiences, hopes, and needs. So we ask questions and we learn from various people of faith and wisdom. And in this series, we are reflecting on the fundamental question of the meaning of Christianity in the 21st century. And the series is entitled Christianity in the Age of Anxiety. And it is my honor to introduce our special guest, Professor Catherine Keller. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Well, Professor Szczerba, I'm very honored to zoom into this conversation with you in this age of anxiety. These kinds of conversations are all the more important, aren't they?
Thank you. Yes. Let me say a few words about Professor Keller. Catherine Keller is a renowned theologian and professor of constructive theology at Drew University in New Jersey. She's an author of hundreds of articles and numerous books, including her last publications, Political Theology of the Earth. I think it's 2018. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with your writing. And I don't know how you find time for that. I think you do not sleep. Or perhaps you write while sleeping. I don't know how it is possible. Well, Professor Keller has played a crucial role in developing Drew University's transdisciplinary theological colloquium, and it's an important colloquium which brings theology to conversation with various movements and perspectives on religion, science, contemporary political thought, theology. And I think it's really important what you do, showing the role and relevance of theology today in a fresh, interdisciplinary way. And I especially like the concept of theopoetics, suggesting, as I understand it, that theology is closer to poetry than physics. And just as poetry can speak straight to the heart, also theology can speak to the reader in an aesthetic, existential way to inspire a person spiritually. Thank you. I think it's really beautiful. And in her work, Professor Keller puts a special emphasis on social and ecological issues, and particularly brings this relational thinking into theology, ecological interdependence, and human equality and intercommunity, relational nature of the divine and relational nature of people. An important context for her work is process theology, which is traditionally associated with the relational theology of Whitehead. But while reading your text, I can find traces of many other theologians, including my favorite Jürgen Moltmann. Am I right?
Oh, you are so right, yes. And I love that you've just ended your very beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. With a reference to Professor Jürgen Moltmann. His theology is very different from mine and yet deeply related. So thank you for that connection, which is very lively.
Thank you. Okay. When I was preparing for this conversation, I have to tell you, my 9-year-old son, Tony, came to my office, and obviously he wanted to play, and I had to work. So, well, he was not very happy, but we started to talk about, this work. So we started talking about you, your publications, and then I mentioned process theology. And he immediately asked me about this strange thing. So, you know how it is with a simple theological concepts. First, I froze, and then I tried to explain to him the idea of process theology as well as I could. And I thought I did a pretty good job. But, afterwards, he looked at me, frowned, and said, I do not think so. So, please help me. How would you explain process theology to a 9-year-old boy in a few words? And I have to say he's very impatient.
Oh, I would find it almost impossible to explain process theology to most 19-year-olds or 29-year-olds or 90-year-olds. But But sometimes communication happens. Oh, what an amazing son to be having these conversations with. I would just say to him, you know, you're not very bored with life, are you? And he'd say, no, I'm not bored, right? And I'd want to ask him, why aren't you bored? And maybe he'd say, because things change and there's adventure and I do new things, different things. And if we got that far, I think I'd have him. I'd say, that's what the world is about. It is change. And newness is everywhere, always. And God loves it. And God hates when the newness is mean and destructive. But God is keeping the world open and adventurous. So you will never be bored. Okay, I give up.
Thank you. I think it's very helpful. I think he will understand some, and also I will understand some as well.
I want to hear what he thinks.
Okay. Yeah, I'll tell you. Okay, I have this. I would like to start our conversation with a big question. But when I'm reading your text, you're asking big questions. So let me ask one. Do we need God anymore in the beginning of the 21st century? Or to be more precise, do we need God in the beginning of 21st century to explain our reality and to find ourselves in this crazy world?
Yes, that's big with capital B question. But it's a great question. And really, those are slightly different questions. Because I would say to the first, do we need God in the 21st century? Yes, more than ever. But do we need God in order to explain reality in the 21st century? I think the answer is not necessarily. As a theologian, it is so important for me to practice regularly, talk about the world and our responsibility for it in secular terms. It is so important to me that theology be in a rich exchange with the natural sciences, with the arts, and the arts are about 99% strong secular, though they have great depths of holiness in them. But I would say that about science too. It's just most scientists don't recognize that. So I think it's crucial for us to be in dialogue with secular people across multiple disciplines and publics. At the same time, that it's crucial for us to be in dialogue as Christian theologians, it's just as Christians, with people of other religions as well. So I think that the way we explain the meaning of the world needs to be flexible depending on whom we're speaking to. So sometimes it's important not to say God. It's important to talk about the depth of reality, or about the mystery, or about the deep uncertainty, just to use the language of quantum physics. And I have done a lot with quantum physics for that reason. The indeterminacy and the uncertainty make contact with the mystical depths of Christian theology. So for me, theology is always a hermeneutical practice, a practice of deep translation, and that has to be into languages that are secular. Does that mean that Christianity and its talk of God is just going to disappear? I think that's possible. I think a lot of really terrible things are possible, and some of them worse than that. Like, it's possible that our species will go extinct before another century is out. That's possible. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think God talk is going to disappear either. but I think that it is going to remain a minority discourse, at least in much of the Northern world, for the foreseeable future. So I think our translational skills between theological God talk and secular talk about the meaning of life is crucial. And I think it's good for our theology. Why? It's good for our theology to engage secular language and secular criticism and secular doubt, because it helps heal us of our dogmatic certainties, of our abuse sometimes of theological power, our use of God talk as a kind of club for threatening and pushing people into unity and agreement, with always the ultimate threat of hell behind it. We have some very bad habits with our God talk. And so these secular conversations, I think, are therapeutic for theology, and they give a language of God more of a hope of surviving for the indefinite future, maybe even going through a renaissance.
Yeah, I agree. You refer to this secularism. Let me refer to that. And I'm thinking of secularism in terms of old ideas of Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, or Freud, but also I'm thinking of the process that we are observing in Europe right now. And it seems, according to various analysis, that something like 40% of citizens of Europe have serious doubts about the existence of God, as atheists or agnostics. And even especially when it comes to younger generations, something like 30 years of age and younger, it's even it's bigger. It's more than 50% of people really have problems with religion and with God. Really, even in Poland, we are a very religious country. Extremely religious, I would say. Only 16% of young people admitted that religion plays an important role in their life. So it's astonishing. And then we are looking at the most secular countries in Europe, like, I don't know, Denmark or Czech Republic, or Norway or the Netherlands. And it's interesting that these countries are doing pretty well, socially, economically, politically, morally. Actually, when I'm thinking about the good examples of civil society, these are the countries. And they are not using this God hypothesis to explain reality. They live somehow without religion. Whereas religious countries, like my country, we find quite often or sometimes horrible examples of nationalisms and homophobia and xenophobia, like the anti-immigrant movements. And then when we are in my country, when we are thinking, or when we are asking young people, what do they think about Christianity? What are their collocations? They would quite often say Christianity is a political entity. And then they would refer to Christianity financial scandals, moral scandals, pedophilia, and they would also indicate that churches are power systems or oppressive power systems. So in this context, again, I could refer to this old Nietzsche's language. Do we really need God produced by religion or by these unjust systems as much as it was needed in the past?
That's a powerfully put question, or actually analysis hidden in your question, because I suspect that the question is something you're already hinting at an answer to, that perhaps that's not the God that we need. Perhaps that God of patriarchal and theocratic dominance, that God who must not be doubted, perhaps that one really had to die, and probably has died for all people who think seriously. But of course, the death of that God is simply not the same as the death of God. So I think, indeed, in this century, that distinction becomes more vivid and more alive. Why? Because alternative forms of theism have been growing deep and long traditions. I mean, they always existed. There were always strong alternatives, sometimes persecuted and annihilated within the church, within Catholic Church, the medieval period. There were strong counter movements and efforts at Reformation before the big heretical Reformation worked. And then there was the radical Reformation immediately. Then the Orthodox Reformation brutally suppressed. So Christianity itself has been in tremendous travail all along, even within very theocratic societies. There have been voices of protest. But since over the last 100 years or so, a lot of space has opened for secular voices of criticism. There's also been a chance for alternative theisms to grow, for rich alternative theologies to develop, process theology being just one of them. Feminist theology hit me at the same time as process theology did, when I was 19 and really open to totally let go of that nonsensical God talk. I was reading Nietzsche and Zen Buddhism, or to listen to these other odd voices that, by the grace of this alternative God, got into my life. I encountered very early a social justice Christianity, Christians who were out on the streets where I was protesting the Vietnam War, and Christians who were fighting for women's equality within the churches, for women's ordination. My denomination has done that for 50 years, ordained women. So I encountered that alternative already in the 1970s. It was already institutionalized enough. What I'm saying is, I think that gradually that good news, is getting around. And you have also a growing secular public who encounter these alternative Christianities and want to create allegiances with them. And that's going on very formally. Political theorists, my favorite one is William Connolly, who's a non-theist. He won't say atheist. He thinks that's too aggressive. He says non-theist. Yeah. And in book after book, he writes about the importance of creating broad coalitions for an ethical common life together, for a strong socially and economically just democracy, and that those social coalitions must include religious groups, those that are also committed to social justice and to ecological sustainability. And he names them, and he's in dialogue. He and I do a lot of dialogue together. And he's extremely influential for political theory in the United States on the liberal progressive side. So I think that there is developing a potentiality that isn't just in a few intellectual corners and caves. I think it begins to spill out into the marketplace. You probably didn't spend all last night, which would have been the middle of your night, watching the last night of our Democratic convention. But one of the highlights was when Sister Simone Campbell, a radical nun, one of the nuns who for years has been leading social justice actions, that she gave a prayer, and she gave the prayer looking right out at the public, and it was a prayer to the great breath of life, to the Holy Spirit, and to bring out of us and out of our work together a new world of justice, a new creation out of chaos. This was to an audience of tens of millions of people. This worker nun, not wearing a habit, dressed like I am, and praying to the Holy Spirit, facing all of us, the Spirit in all of us, and using the meaning of spirit, which of course in the ancient languages is breath, which you know what that means in the United States right now, where some of us literally can't breathe. So this is a Christianity that's gaining force. This was the Christianity chosen to bring in the religious aspect of former Vice President, and hopefully new President Biden's background. He's a regular practicing Catholic, and he's very motivated by his faith, which is radically ecumenical. He's been working for decades with the leaders of Black evangelical Protestant churches. So this is a secular country officially, and we are the country with perhaps the most destructive practice of Christianity in the world. Maybe not the worst the world has ever known, but the worst and most powerful the world knows now, with our 30% white, conservative, fundamentalist Christian constituency. And yet we're formally the first secular nation, the first formally secular nation. And Biden, fortunately, is working skillfully between a transformed social justice Christianity that can push back against our religious right wing and its political force. And for the most part, he speaks completely secular language. So he's just an example of how I think an alternative kind of God talk is coming into play, not just in secret little elite or progressive corners that are fading out. No, I think its day might come.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Be coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for this example. So we're able to talk because of the strange context we are in, of the somehow pandemics. Otherwise, probably, well, I don't know. But I have to ask this question. And is COVID pandemic God's punishment or God's lesson?
Yes, you do have to ask that question. Early on in the pandemic, I wrote a pastoral letter about this. It got around quite a bit, surprisingly, because I had to ask those questions just for my students. Many of my students, of course, become Protestant pastors, and many of my former students are Protestant pastors. So it's crucial. And I ask, is God punishing us with this pandemic? Is God testing us with this pandemic? Or is God trying to teach us something with this pandemic? The answer to the first question, is God punishing? Absolutely no. Is God trying to teach us a lesson that we'll never forget? No. Is God trying actually to teach us something? That I'll come back to. But the other one, is God testing us? Not that either. But what I wanted to say is, and this is process theology, this is where I really am grateful for it. No, God is not in control of our realities. God is not causing the ugly things to happen. God is not causing the pestilences, the plagues, the pandemic. God is not causing the racism. God is not causing the genocides. God is not causing the evil in the world. And yet so many Christians are trapped within a theology that thinks that, at least with the big things, it must be God's will. And some people, some strict kinds of Calvinists, think that everything that happens is God's will. You know, as Calvin said, the twist of a snowflake was willed from all eternity. Well, that's one extreme kind of theology. What I agree with all of it about is God is involved in everything. God is involved in everything that happens. God is present in everything that happens, at least what I can call God. That doesn't mean that God is causing. For process theology, God isn't the cause of the bad things. And God isn't the simple cause of the good things either. God is the source of possibilities. God is the call to the good. God gives us possibilities fresh every moment. This is what the parables are all about in the New Testament. It's not about some God just stepping into rearranging things, or some king on the throne saying to his generals, go and burn down that town for their disobedience, or go and spread the plague to that country because they haven't been faithful to me. No, this is the God who is spreading the seeds to all the soils, and it's up to what kind of soil as to whether the seeds grow. That's the God of process theology, the one who shares richly these seeds, and they're little seeds. One of them is the mustard seed even, or it's the little coin that the woman goes and buries when she finds it. It's subtle action. That's what the best of the biblical teachings communicates to us, but it's always happening. But it's action that requires us to realize it. So is God trying to teach us a lesson? Well, God is not causing bad things so that we will learn a lesson and become good little children of God. No. But, of course, God is trying to help us to learn from all of the bad things. In that way, God would like to teach us a lesson, but we have to teach it to each other. We have to let those seeds of divine grace and goodness and beauty grow in us and in our worlds. And some of them we better grow really fast, because a lot of the plants of the world and a lot of the beautiful seeds of the creation are being systematically annihilated by our ecological practices, ours, especially the United States, and its global impact. So it's up to, but to just summarize, yes, with this pandemic, of course, God would trying to help us to learn from this, trying to help us not just to go back to normal, no, to go to a much better normal, to learn that our relation to the natural world is not working, and our relation to each other is not working either. And that's so obvious from the race statistics about the effects of the pandemic in the United States. So God wants us, is calling us to learn and to come into transformation, but God is not causing any of the evils in order to punish us.
Yeah. So what do you think? How will the world look like after the pandemics? Will it go back to the previous form of existence? What will be the new normal, let's say, or what might be the changes that might be brought to our reality?
Well, of course, no one knows what will be the reality, because the future is open. The future is not predetermined. And I would add, even God doesn't know exactly what's going to be in the near future, because God has called forth a very open-ended creation with a lot of human choices to be made. What I hope for, and that means what I do believe is possible, is that people are really learning about how intimately interconnected we are by this very social distancing. Like we are becoming so conscious of our interdependence with each other. We miss each other. We miss the chance for a handshake or a hug, and just to feel the fullness of human bodily presence, and to be able to be out in our world. So there's a lot that we miss that perhaps we will appreciate more. But the real hope is that it's not that we just miss what was and we want to go back to normal, but that we also, enough of us, a critical mass of us, are learning a deep lesson from this pandemic, which seems to have been caused by bad human relationships to non-human animals, especially bats and perhaps pangolins. That is, it's about It's about irresponsible impingement of human habitats on non-human habitats. And that's just going on all over the planet. And it has all kinds of ecological ramifications. The most obvious is deforestation. And what that's doing, since the trees are the lungs of the earth. But I won't get off into all of that. Just to say that I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful that that's a Karl Barth distinction. Christians are not optimists or pessimists. We are hopeful. I am hopeful that we will learn that we need to radically correct our imbalanced relationship to non-human animals and other species and systems because of the pandemic of COVID-19, but also the pandemic of racism, as you wrote in your note to me, and because of the pandemic of all pandemics, which is the economic causes of climate change, which has to be addressed very quickly, as you know, within 10 years, dramatically, and the United States has been taking us galloping in the wrong direction, galloping on that. I'm thinking of the 4 horses of the apocalypse. So we've been off in the wrong direction. I am hopeful that a critical mass of us are realizing that we need seriously to make the shifts that we know intellectually. Enough of the majority know intellectually, but they don't make it a priority here. I'm hoping that the majority of us can make it a priority to really shift on these different fronts of our apocalypse. 5 different fronts. We've got COVID coming to a fore. We've got white supremacism coming to a head. We've got economic collapse going on horrendously here with millions of job losses, tens of millions now. We've got the threat to democracy itself in this country, not just to a decent liberal democracy, but the threat to democracy. And then all of those 4 sealed by climate change. I'm hoping, and the Democratic Convention has strengthened my hope, that enough of us get it and can use this pandemic in this way with these kinds of more public communications, even as we have more meditative private time. So in that deep solitude and in these broad communications, maybe enough of us can hear and can heed the creative desire of God for a renewed creation.
I'm hopeful too. I would say I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. I love this phrase. Yes, is
that a Polish distinction too, by the way?
It's Barth. It's universal.
But the words you can distinguish hope and optimism in Polish.
Yes,
Good.
Absolutely. Yes. We are coping with different pandemics, and as you said, one of them is this racial pandemics. And in Poland, we may talk about this nationalistic pandemic. And well, in May we were following this news of protests and riots after the death of George Floyd. And really, these mottos, I can't breathe, Black Lives Matter, they were heard everywhere, in London, Brussels, Paris, Warsaw. In Warsaw, I even saw, this small Afro-American or Afro-Polish girl just holding this banner saying, "Don't call me Negro," Murzyn in Polish. And this was amazing, really. This was startling, paralyzing. But, now, it's a different question, different situation. And I'm even sorry for mentioning that, but it seems that almost nobody here remembers about George Floyd anymore. It seems like past news. Even though I have seen pictures of Polish police behaving in a very similar way to Minneapolis police toward the LGBT people, really horrible. So my question would be, what might be the outcomes of George Floyd's death now and in a longer perspective? Or is it going to be forgotten?
It will not be forgotten here. It redefined the Democratic National Convention all 4 nights. It was all on television, and it was constant African-American presence of leaders, of children, of activists. It's been, and that's risky for the Democratic Party. They can lose their center while they appeal to the base. But here it won't be forgotten because there's such a strong now organized force of activists, African-American and people of color, and a lot of white folk, especially young ones, but all of our ages, who are now in a renewed solidarity. I mean, like all of my students, some of them doctoral students, are building in race analysis to dissertations that otherwise, or theses that otherwise focus on environmental justice or on issues of religious pluralism. They're going to go on working on those very important themes, but they're all now integrating the question of white supremacism into it. So that won't be forgotten here, and George Floyd won't be forgotten. Eric Garner was not quite forgotten either, who in 2014 died calling out, "I can't breathe." But the repetition has created a deep tattoo on the body of this country. But that doesn't mean it's all going to get fixed, but it won't be forgotten. And yeah, I just think it's amazing that around the world there were demonstrations in such solidarity and using the name of George Floyd, and your image of the little girl in Poland is wonderful. But other countries don't have to carry the burden of, the name of George Floyd and of our specific racial issues. It works differently in different contexts. Europe has its own history of course, of white supremacism. It's where we got ours. Yeah. But we have the history of slavery and of the importing of millions of Africans. So it's a different history. And the way in which immigration issues work is also different. We have that problem too. We have horrible immigration practices under the present so-called president. But I'm just saying the issues are differently framed and have to be differently framed in Poland, and priorities have to ebb and flow. They come and they go, as they must here. I'm sure very soon something will bring LGBTQI issues right back up into center stage. For us, we have some basic rights that are holding more or less. There's a lot of systemic homophobia here, but the issue of actual legal rights is not right now in our central focus, but it could be in a month or in a year. Yeah. So I think there always has to be the shifting of attention, don't you? But if one can hold the deep intersections at some level, and maybe that's where the work of intellectuals, of scholars, of pastors, of public teachers, of thinkers has to be. Just the work of thinkers to keep the intersections conscious so that they can be ready to be brought into public focus when the moment is right, because they can't all stay in focus all the time.
Yeah. It seems to me that we are really talking about theodicy somehow, or walking around the issue of theodicy. And well, I'm thinking of Gottfried Leibniz in the 17th century, and he really shaped this term. And he, in his mathematical mind, he believed that we live in the best possible world, that the all good surpasses the all evil in the world, especially if we take into consideration the free will of human beings. Would you agree with that? Do we live in the best possible world?
Oh, by God, I hope not. I suspect there are dozens, hundreds, maybe millions of other planets out in this multiverse of ours where very interesting life forms, much smarter and much more ethical than ours, have evolved. But I do not know any of that. And even if we're the only self-conscious life form in the universe, we clearly are not doing even the best of what's possible in our own little world. But, I'm sympathetic with Leibniz. I realized that what he was trying to think through was not so much divine power and control of everything. What he had, which was his radical, really very fresh insight, was that the whole world is contained in each one of us, in each creature. And that is, I think, deeply true. And process theology gets that from him. Whitehead gets that really, really probably from Leibniz more than anywhere else. The insight, in Whitehead's words, that you are in the world and the world is in you. Right? So, but it doesn't, so we have that same insight that Leibniz had, but Leibniz was so impressed with the novelty, I think, of thinking through that everything is intertwined in everything else, that it seemed to him like some great harmony, that if, because everything's so deeply connected, if we would just understand it better, we would see that it is the best that can be. I think that's the mistake, but his radical insight into the way that the macrocosm is present, summed up in the microcosm, I believe is a deep truth about the universe. And it's a truth that we see interesting forms of physics and biology, complexity biology, moving very close to. Let me not get off into that, but the interconnectivity is real. But what then process theology says, especially in response to the theodicy question, is in our connectedness, we take in good influences, but also bad ones. If I am being abused as a child by a parent, I'm being deeply damaged through a relationship that is very formative. And unless other very good relationships become part of me too, I might then also pass on that abuse. Because this relational formation is so strong, and then I will form others in relation to me in an abusive way, unless there is healing, responsiveness to the lure of God, also what we just call loving ethical presence. So relationships are morally neutral. Relationality can bring great good and great evil. And a lot of neutrality too, a lot of everyday repetition. Yeah. So process theology says in our interrelatedness is great good, great evil, but the new possibility of the good is offered to each one of us, each creature, every moment at a deep level by what we call God. So no, God doesn't have to be justified in terms of theodicy by this being the best of all possible worlds. God doesn't have to be justified because God is not not interested in controlling. God is interested in loving and in relating and in bringing forth greater and more complex kinds of beauty in the world. So we don't have to justify God. We have to call ourselves into justice, because our relationships can do us in, our relationships of white supremacism, our relationships of denialism about climate change, our relationships of numbness, but our relationships that are attentive to the life of the world can bring new life to each and all of us. but then the life of God, the great breath of the universe, can really breathe through us.
Thank you. It's beautiful, really. And when I was reading your texts, I think this beauty, this this aesthetic side of your writing is really important. I really loved it, but I also had to say that at times it was not easy to read for a non-English speaking person. You know, like the words like metaphors or theopoetic or intercarnations or geotemporality or political. So my first question to you was, do you like playing with words? And yeah.
Let me answer very straightforwardly, yes. But,
yeah.
You know, but this has to do with relational influences early in my life. I think my mother had a lot of artistic talent. She didn't have a chance to realize it in any formal or public sense, but I think I absorbed a lot of her sensitivity for poetry. She wrote a lot of poetry. It all got lost in a move. A big barrel of her poetry got lost. And she also painted early, around when I was born. Then she had to stop in order to make sure I had a life. But so I have picked that up, but I realize that it makes for difficult translation works. My On the Mystery, which I wrote in a more straightforward language as a more pedagogical text, does get translated a lot, at least into German and Korean, just out in Korea. But my more serious or longer, deeper books are not readily translatable. I think that's right, because there's so much play on the roots of language. I'm lucky that there is an important minority of thinkers through the world, like you, whose English is amazing.
I loved it. Actually, when I was reading your text, I was thinking of Dante Alighieri, and I was thinking how the Divine Comedy may look like in 21st century. And I think he had this aesthetic side of theology in mind as well, and I think it's quite important. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for that beautiful connection to Dante.
So I have your last question to you. What would be your message in the context of our conversation? Just one idea, something that you would like to tell our students or our Polish public?
Right. Well, I've been working in the book that I'm finishing right now, which I hope will be translatable for a wide public. It's a book called Facing Apocalypse. I'm working on that metaphor of apocalypse, and you mentioned metaphors. I had to say it's not just a metaphor, it's very forceful, a metaphors. It's very strongly operative, of course, especially in the United States, with our long history of fundamentalist, very apocalyptic Christianity. But I've made my peace with John of Patmos, the author of the Book of Revelation. In recent years, I've realized he was truly a revolutionary in a deeply visionary spiritual sense, in the sense of the Hebrew prophets. But he was renewing the hope for the new heaven and earth. But people can read my book when it comes out to get into all of that. Let me just say that often now we hear the metaphor of apocalypse because there are such big systemic collapses that threaten us environmentally, economically, politically, racially, and pandemically. We hear the metaphor of apocalypse a lot. So I think it's good for some of us to be ready to say, yes, this is apocalypse, but in the real sense, in the original sense. The apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. In the Bible, the world does not ever end, ever. There is dramatic, creative transformation. The new heaven and earth, the new creation, doesn't mean the old one is just tossed out and a completely new one is created from scratch. It's a radical renewal of the world. That's why in the book of Revelation, all the kings come into the gates of the New Jerusalem. Same old nations are there. They just aren't under the degrading, oppressive power of the empire, Rome in his time. So what I want to simplify it all down to is to say, yes, we are in an apocalyptic moment. And because of climate change, perhaps the most serious we've encountered, though the nuclear threat came very close, very close. And so we must get word out. Apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. It means radical new beginning. Apocalypse literally means unveiling. It means opening up, not closing down. Disclosure, not closure. So when we find our life together moving into catastrophe, let's remember that a catastrophe can serve as a catalyst. I think that's right now what I want us to understand. Catastrophe can be a catalyst. Emergency can provoke emergence of the new possibility, the possibility that what a lot of us mean by God could actually get realized in a new and needed way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Catherine, I would like to say it was a pleasure and honor for me to talk to you. And well, thank you. I will be thinking about our thoughts, and well, it really will stay with me for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Szczerba. This has been, for me, a very meaningful conversation.
Thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you perhaps sometime in person in Poland.
Oh, yes, please feel invited.
Thank you very much. Come our way too.
Yeah.
Come through New York City.